The mornings always started the same for me. A cup of lukewarm coffee, the faint hum of the radio, and the familiar ache of a quiet house. At 52, life had become a series of routines. The days bled into one another, a predictable cadence of work, errands, and solitude. I wasn't unhappy exactly, but I wouldn't have called myself fulfilled either. That Tuesday was no different. I pushed my cart down the grocery store aisle, scanning the shelves for my usual items. Whole grain bread, a carton of eggs, the small indulgence of dark chocolate. My list was in my hand, though I hardly needed it. The familiarity of the task was both comforting and stifling. Then it happened. I reached for a box of tea perched high on the shelf, my fingers just brushing the edge, when a voice behind me said, "Need a hand with that?" I turned startled, and there he was. He couldn't have been more than 30 tall, with dark, tousled hair and a smile that managed to be both kind and mischievous. He plucked the tea effortlessly from the shelf and handed it to me. "Thank you," I said, feeling oddly self-conscious under his warm gaze. "Happy to help," he replied, his voice carrying a lightness I hadn't heard in years. "I'm Ian, by the way." "Claire," I said, clutching the tea box a little tighter than necessary. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, the moment lingered. He didn't rush off, and neither did I. We exchanged a few pleasantries, small talk about the unpredictable weather, the ever-increasing price of groceries, but it felt different. When he finally moved on, I stood there for a moment longer, the box of tea still in my hand, a faint smile tugging at my lips. The encounter was brief, unremarkable in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a spark of light in a life that had grown dim. I didn't know then that this fleeting interaction would be the beginning of something that would upend everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, and about the unpredictable beauty of life. It was a week later when I saw him again. I hadn't expected to. Our first meeting seemed like one of those fleeting moments that pass without consequence. But there he was, standing in the produce section, carefully inspecting a pineapple. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should approach him. Before I could decide, he looked up and saw me. His face lit up with recognition, and he raised a hand in greeting. "Claire, right?" he said, his voice carrying across the aisle. I nodded, smiling despite myself. "You have a good memory. It's not every day you meet someone struggling to reach tea on the top shelf," he teased, his grin widening. The conversation flowed easily, more so than it had the first time. We talked about his love for cooking, hence the pineapple, and I admitted my lack of culinary skills but shared my penchant for simple, hearty meals. By the time we parted, I felt lighter, as though some invisible weight I hadn't even noticed had been lifted. It was such a small thing, really, just a conversation in a grocery store, but it stayed with me long after I got home. Over the next few weeks, these encounters became a regular occurrence. Sometimes we'd bump into each other near the frozen foods. Other times, it was by the bakery. Each meeting brought with it more conversation, more laughter, and an ease I hadn't felt in years. One Saturday morning, he spotted me debating between 2 brands of coffee and walked over with a knowing smile. "Go with this one," he said, picking one and placing it in my cart. "Oh, and why is that?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's my favorite," he replied. "And trust me, I have impeccable taste." I laughed, the sound surprising even me. "I'll take your word for it." Those moments, however small, began to add up. He was quickly becoming a part of my routine, though I couldn't quite bring myself to admit how much I looked forward to seeing him. It was as though life had gained a touch of color, a hint of something new and uncharted. I found myself lingering in the store a little longer, hoping to run into him, and when I didn't, I felt a twinge of disappointment. It wasn't just his charm or his easy humor. It was the way he made me feel seen, as though I were more than just another face in the crowd. I didn't yet know what this connection would lead to, but I was beginning to realize how much I cherished it. For the first time in years, the monotony of my days felt less suffocating, replaced by a quiet anticipation I couldn't quite name. By now, our encounters at the grocery store had evolved into something more deliberate. It started with Ian casually suggesting a coffee after one of our chats. A simple, "Let's keep this conversation going." I had hesitated, my mind racing with excuses, but the hopeful look in his eyes had swayed me. We found ourselves at a small cafe just down the street, the kind of place I rarely visited anymore. Over steaming cups of coffee, We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his work as a freelance designer, his love of art and architecture, and the satisfaction he found in creating things from scratch. In return, I shared fragments of my life, my career in bookkeeping, my love of gardening, and how I found solace in reading. I left out the loneliness, the quiet evenings that stretched on endlessly, but something in Ian's gaze told me he sensed it anyway. "You've got this incredible way of listening," he said at one point, his voice thoughtful. "Like you're not just hearing words but understanding the spaces in between them." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a blush creep into my cheeks. "Well, that's kind of you to say," I replied, brushing it off lightly. But his words stayed with me. It had been so long since anyone had truly noticed me, let alone voiced it with such sincerity. After that day, our friendship began to take shape. Ian started texting me, nothing too serious, just little messages about a book he'd found interesting or a funny moment from his day. At first, I was cautious, responding with careful politeness. But over time, our exchanges grew more natural, playful even. One evening, he sent me a photo of a disastrous attempt at making lasagna, the noodles half-burned and the sauce an unappetizing shade of brown. "Master Chef strikes again," his message read, followed by a laughing emoji. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. "Maybe stick to designing kitchens instead of cooking in them," I replied. The banter felt easy and forced, and with every exchange, I found myself smiling more. He had a way of drawing me out of my shell, of making me feel lighter, younger even. The age gap that had seemed so stark at first began to fade into the background, replaced by the simple pleasure of enjoying his company. For the first time in years, I felt as though my life wasn't just a series of routines. There was something new here, something that made the ordinary moments feel extraordinary. I didn't want to overthink it, but I couldn't deny the warmth that spread through me whenever I thought of him. Whatever this was, it felt good, and after years of quiet longing for something more, I decided to let myself enjoy it, even if just for a little while. One evening, after a particularly mundane day at work, I found myself sitting on the couch with my favorite book. But for once, the words blurred on the page, unable to hold my attention. My thoughts kept drifting back to Ian, his smile, his laugh, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about something he was passionate about. It all replayed in my mind like a highlight reel. I found myself smiling without meaning to, a soft, involuntary curve of my lips. And then it hit me. This wasn't just friendship anymore. I set the book down, my pulse quickening as the weight of the realization settled over me. Somewhere along the way, my feelings for Ian had deepened into something I hadn't expected, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The thought terrified me. He was younger, so much younger, and it wasn't just the number of years that separated us, it was the weight of society's judgment, the whispers I could already imagine if anyone knew. I could almost hear the questions. What could he possibly see in her? Doesn't she know better? But mixed with the fear was something else, something warm and intoxicating. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in decades, like I was stepping into the sunlight after years in the shadows. Still, the doubts crept in, relentless and unyielding. What if he doesn't feel the same way? What if I'm just a passing novelty to him? I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to calm the swirl of emotions. It felt absurd to even entertain the possibility of anything more. I was 52. I had lived through love and loss, through years of routine and resignation. Falling for someone like Ian felt impossible, but it didn't stop the memory of his voice from replaying in my mind, or the way his presence seemed to linger long after he was gone. I sighed, leaning back against the couch and staring at the ceiling. This wasn't something I could ignore anymore. Whether I wanted to admit it or not, my feelings for Ian had become a part of me, a fragile, exhilarating truth I didn't know what to do with. For now, I decided I would keep it to myself. Maybe it was just a fleeting crush, a harmless spark in a life that had grown too quiet. But deep down, I knew it was more than that, and that terrified me most of all. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I threw myself into work, chores, and anything else that could keep my mind busy. But no matter how hard I tried, Ian lingered in my thoughts. It wasn't just the way he made me laugh or the ease of our conversations. It was how he made me feel seen. One afternoon, as I was tending to the small garden in my backyard, I caught myself smiling at the memory of his last text. He had sent a picture of a stray cat he'd befriended on his morning walk, followed by a series of ridiculous names he was considering for it. Should I go with Sir Pause-a-lot or Whiskerford? He'd written, and I could practically hear the laughter in his voice. I shook my head, brushing soil off my hands, but the smile stayed. And that's when the doubts came rushing back, like a cold wind cutting through a warm day. What are you doing, Claire? I was old enough to be his mother. What if he saw me as nothing more than a quirky older friend? What if I crossed a line and ruined the connection we'd built? That evening, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, scrutinizing every fine line and silver strand. It wasn't vanity, it was fear. Fear of rejection, of humiliation, of daring to hope for something I'd long convinced myself was out of reach. And yet, beneath the doubt, there was a quiet voice whispering, what if? What if he felt the same? What if this wasn't just my imagination running wild? The thought was enough to send a thrill through me, even as I tried to dismiss it. I found myself analyzing our interactions, searching for signs. The way his eyes seemed to linger when we talked, the warmth in his smile, the way he sought me out even when he didn't have to. Were these the marks of friendship, or was there something more beneath the surface? I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty was both exhilarating and maddening. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I didn't know where this path might lead, but I couldn't let fear dictate my life anymore. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe I was setting myself up for heartbreak. But I was tired of living in the shadows, of letting the what-ifs hold me back. For the first time in years, I felt like I had something worth risking. And that was a feeling I wasn't ready to let go of. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. I found myself searching for reasons to invite Ian over, something simple, something that didn't feel too overwhelming. A casual coffee? No, that was too familiar. Too ordinary. A request for advice on something. It might seem forced, too obvious. But then one morning it came to me. I had mentioned in passing during one of our many chats that my garden had gotten out of hand. Too many weeds, the flowers needing pruning, the hedges wild and unkempt. Ian had laughed, teasing me for letting nature take over, but something about the way he spoke made me think he might actually be good at this. So, with a mixture of excitement and hesitation, I typed out a message to him. Hey Ian, I was wondering if you might have some time this weekend to help me tame my garden. It's gotten a little out of control, and I could really use a hand. Plus, I'll make lunch as a thank you. There it was. The invitation. Simple, nonchalant, but charged with the undercurrent of something more. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure whether I should send it or not. But then I reminded myself of everything I had been grappling with, the way Ian made me feel, the way I was starting to look forward to his presence. And so I pressed send, heart thumping in my chest. The reply came almost instantly. I'd love to. I'm pretty good with plans, and I'll definitely take you up on that lunch offer. What time? I exhaled in relief, but the knot in my stomach remained. It was happening. This small act, this quiet invitation, was a step forward into uncharted territory. The days leading up to his visit felt like a slow burn. I cleaned the house, dusted off the patio furniture, and picked out a simple but comforting menu. Grilled chicken, a fresh salad, and a warm apple crumble for dessert. Nothing too fancy, but enough to show I cared. On the day of his arrival, I found myself pacing, nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. I had invited friends over before, even had family gatherings, but this felt different. This was Ian, and something told me that this wasn't just a garden project anymore. It was an opportunity to take a step forward into the unknown. When Ian finally arrived, his presence felt like a jolt of energy. He greeted me with that familiar smile, his eyes bright with the same easy charm. He wore an old t-shirt and jeans, the kind of relaxed outfit that made him look effortlessly comfortable, and he brought with him a gardening kit, which he presented with a mock flourish. I'm here to save your garden, he said with a grin, holding up the tools like a knight brandishing a sword. I couldn't help but laugh, the tension in my body easing as I led him to the backyard. We immediately fell into a rhythm, working side by side, our conversation flowing easily. There were no awkward silences, no forced words, just the steady sound of hands working with soil and leaves, the occasional laughter as we joked about my less-than-ideal gardening skills. At one point, Ian paused, wiping his brow, and looked over at me. "I have to say, I'm impressed," he said, his voice soft. "You've got a lot of beautiful things here, even if they're a little hidden under all the weeds." I felt my heart flutter. His words, simple as they were, felt like more than a compliment. They felt like an acknowledgement, as though he saw something in me that I hadn't realized was there. By the time we finished, the garden looked transformed, neat and tended to. The sun was starting to set, casting a soft golden glow over everything. I invited him to sit on the patio, the table set with the lunch I had prepared. As we ate, the conversation deepened. We spoke about life, his dreams, his fears, his ambitions, and I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't in a long time. The connection between us felt undeniable, stronger now, almost palpable. Every word, every shared laugh, seemed to pull us closer. There was a moment, just as we were finishing our dessert, when our eyes met, and I felt a shift. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but in that silent moment I knew. He felt it too. The distance that had always existed between us, whether it was the years, the expectations, or the uncertainty, had narrowed, and we were no longer just two people sharing a meal. We were something more, something I couldn't yet name but could feel with every breath. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to let myself feel it. The days that followed Ian's visit were like a dream I didn't want to wake from. Our connection had shifted, but neither of us spoke about it, not directly. Instead, we continued with the rhythm we had settled into, sharing messages, small outings, and laughter-filled conversations. Yet, everything felt different now, as if an unspoken thread had connected us in a way neither of us could deny. I found myself looking forward to his texts, to his jokes, to hearing his voice. Each interaction, no matter how small, seemed to fill some emptiness I hadn't realized was there. And when we weren't talking, I would replay moments in my mind. The warmth of his presence, the way his hand brushed mine as we worked together, the glint in his eyes that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. It was a quiet kind of tension, the kind that made every word feel heavy with meaning. And yet we danced around it, as if waiting for the other to make a move. One evening, as we sat on the porch after dinner, I couldn't help but notice the way the evening light hit his face, soft and golden. He was laughing about something I had said, probably a silly attempt at a joke, but for some reason it made my heart race. His laugh faded as he caught my eye, and for a moment, there was a stillness between us. The air was thick, not with discomfort, but with something more tangible. His gaze lingered just a beat too long. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to break the silence, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, I realized. This was the moment where everything could change. And then, almost as if he had read my mind, Ian leaned forward slightly, his voice lower than usual. "Claire." I held my breath, waiting. The world seemed to pause, everything focused on his next words. "I feel like there's something here," he continued, his gaze not leaving mine. "Something between us. I don't know if I'm just imagining it, but I don't think I am." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. His words were both a relief and a revelation. My heart soared, but there was also a rush of fear. The truth was out now, out in the open, hanging in the space between us. I swallowed, gathering my thoughts. "Ian, Before I could finish, he smiled softly, a reassuring, almost understanding smile. "It's okay, Claire. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need to say anything. He knew. I knew. We didn't speak for a while after that, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, the kind that comes with knowing that some things are too big for words. And yet, as the night stretched on, as we sat there side by side, I felt something shift in me, a quiet permission, a releasing of all the doubts and fears that had been holding me back. Maybe love, at any age, wasn't about the perfect words or the perfect timing. Maybe it was simply about showing up, being vulnerable, and letting things unfold as they were meant to. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to let go. To not worry about the years between us, or what others might say, or whether I was doing the right thing. I simply allowed myself to feel. And what I felt was this: It was okay. Whatever this was, it was okay. In the days that followed that quiet confession, everything seemed to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Ian and I no longer felt like two people navigating the unsure waters of new friendship. We were something else now, something deeper, though still undefined. The air between us was charged with anticipation, but also a sense of calm, as though we both knew that whatever we were building didn't need to be rushed, nor did it need to be labeled. We saw each other more often, not just for casual hangouts or the occasional meal, but for walks in the park, moments of shared silence, and talks that went late into the evening. There was no pressure to define things immediately, no urgency to make it more than what it was, and yet there was an undeniable connection. A connection that made my heart race and my pulse quicken, even in the simplest of moments. But there were still fears, doubts, and the heavy weight of societal judgment that hung over me. There were moments when I'd catch myself wondering if I was making a fool of myself, if people would talk, if Ian would eventually tire of me. After all, what did a younger man see in someone like me, in a woman in her 50s? What did he want with someone who had already lived so much of life, with so many years ahead of him that I didn't have? These thoughts would creep in, almost like a reflex, whenever I allowed myself to look too far ahead. But then I would remind myself of the moments we shared, of the way he looked at me, of how comfortable I felt in his presence, and of the laughter that filled every space between us. It wasn't just about romance, it was about connection. Real, raw connection. One afternoon, we went to the beach together. I suggested it casually, expecting a day of walking and talking, but what happened instead was something more intimate. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, we sat together on the sand, close enough to feel the warmth of each other's bodies, yet not touching. The world felt vast around us, but in that moment, it felt like we were the only two people in it. There was something about the simplicity of that moment that made everything else fade into the background. The uncertainty, the age difference, the concerns about what others would think. None of it mattered. Without speaking, Ian reached for my hand, his fingers threading through mine. The gesture was so simple, so natural, that I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a grand confession or a dramatic gesture. It was just us, in that moment, acknowledging what was already there. He looked at me then, his gaze steady and warm, as though he was waiting for me to say something, to give him some indication of what I was feeling. But I didn't need words. I had long learned that love didn't always require them. "I think I'm falling for you," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Ian squeezed my hand, his smile soft and understanding. "I think I'm falling for you too." And there it was, the unspoken truth that neither of us had dared to say before, but that had been growing between us all along. We didn't need to define it, we didn't need to make it fit into some perfect mold. We simply needed to let it unfold. As I looked out at the horizon, the uncertainty that had plagued me for so long began to fade. Love wasn't about following the rules, about being the right age or doing the right thing. It was about feeling, about being open to the unexpected, and about embracing the beauty of the moment. In the end, what mattered wasn't the years between us, or the opinions of others. It was us here together. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that was enough.